Hi, everybody, and thanks for listening today to this talk about kelp forests. I'm going to talk about kelp itself, sort of the ecosystem functions that kelp takes, and its role in the broader ecosystem, including trophic cascades, and there'll be links to sliding baselines and ghosts, kind of some more complex ecological ideas that I think are really neat and connected to the kelp forest in a way. So kelp itself is a very large marine algae that is a protist, actually. It's not a plant, though we may call them plants. But it is a protist. And they're relevant for humans in that we use them for food. We use the ecosystems that they provide for food. They stabilize shorelines by protecting them against incoming wave action. They kind of dampen that swell and can make the coastline not experience quite as much wave action. And these are large, biodiverse, functional ecosystems that are fascinating to look into. Kelp forests occur all over the world. We know them sort of best because we're mostly from the U.S., from along the west coast of North America, from Alaska to Baja California. And those forests are dominated by macrocystis, as are many other forests around the world. So the southern coast of South America, along the west coast as well, South Africa, Australia, Japan, and the northeast of the U.S., Europe, and Japan, all these temperate areas with rocky bottoms, and some with even not have these large expansive kelp forests that provide lots of habitat for organisms to live in and space for really complex interactions. So the diversity of kelp itself is pretty neat. We have big forms that like macrocystis, which is top center. And then we have other things like pelagophycus, which grow a bit deeper on the right. That's the elkhorn kelp. And that's a beautiful one of my favorites. And then down in the southern hemisphere a lot, we have the Colonia Radiata, which is in the bottom center of this photograph, and is sort of a lower canopy kelp that forms what they call the subcanopy in the forest. So there's a huge morphological array of kelp, and they can oftentimes exist within a single forest. But not only are there kelp, they are also support a huge food web, which includes all the animals associated with them. So for this, I'll mostly be focused on California itself, but a lot of these topics and points of conversation apply to kelp forests worldwide as well. So in the California kelp forest ecosystems, one of the biggest players is in the bottom right here. That's the California spiny sea urchin. And those guys will cruise around the kelp forest eating kelp, and they can really have dramatic ecological impacts. These are also really neat systems for hosting large invertebrates like lobster and abalone. And we also have sea otter and sheephead and huge diversity of invertebrates and vertebrates alike in these forests. So the food web that these all create is a really complex food web, kind of anchored by the macrocystis itself. Although the phytoplankton and some of the other algae produce primary production just as much as the kelp itself does. But the linkages between the kelp and the rest of the ecosystem are undeniable, not only from an herbivory standpoint, but from a ecosystem structure standpoint. And I'm actually going to add one thing into this, which is that these are completely linked to terrestrial systems as well through beach rack. So these large kelp plants will get pushed on shore, and they'll sit on the sand for weeks sometimes and just rot on the shoreline. And that rotting is the small invertebrates from inside the sandy community, flies, birds. Oftentimes even I've heard stories of skunks foraging in the intertidal on these mats. So these are also connected to terrestrial systems. But like I said, we're going to focus in on this purple sea urchin to macrocystis pyrifera interaction. Macrocystis is the giant kelp. So like I said, these urchins can graze over kelp forests and turn what we see in the image on the left, which is a nice broad kelp forest with probably a good urchin density, but they haven't completely dominated the system yet, to what we see on the right, which is what we call an urchin barren. And urchin barrens are dominated by the urchin itself. They are constantly moving around, eating any sort of propagules that might land. And if some food falls down from maybe a nearby kelp forest, they'll voraciously come in and start eating that kelp. So it's really difficult for this system to transform back into a kelp forest once it's been turned into a barren. And that sort of introduces the idea of stable states. So on the left side, we have kelp forests, and this is represented by this sort of trough in this ball diagram. And it takes a lot of energy to push that ball up over the ridgeline and down into the stable state of the urchin barren. So similarly, it takes just as much energy to push that ball back up over into the kelp forest state. So this wall between is driving something, driving this transition. And so we can start asking the question, well, what drives this sort of threshold change that allows that ball to shift from the left side over to the right side into a sea urchin barren? So the first thing to think about is what eats urchins. And what we find when we look deep into that is that a lot of their predators are gone from the current ecosystems, at least in the southern part of their range. So what used to eat them is otters. Otters will go down and eat them. In Northern California, that's still the case. Otters will swim down and grab an urchin off the bottoms, bring it back up, and they'll smash it open with a rock and eat the urchin. These really large spiny lobsters in the top right will be able to crack open urchins and eat them. Again, really large sheephead will be able to crack them open and eat them. So we have all three of these major predators on urchins that can reduce the populations of the urchins and allow the kelp forest to do really well. But we've, over the last few hundred years, not done such a great job at handling these communities. So in the southern part of the range, the sea otter is completely extinct. It really only exists north of the Big Sur Monterey area now. So in Southern California, this once significant predator of urchins is completely gone. Meanwhile, the lobster and the California sheephead have been overfished to the point where they're so small that the maximum size adults very rarely are able to feed on urchins because the urchins are large and they need these big mouth parts to be able to break them open. So what we see is not so much a system where these three predators and one prey are interacting with each other, but at least now in the southern part of the range, it looks more like this, where we have small lobster, small sheephead, and no otter at all. So that leads to an abundance of the urchin densities, and they can start overgrazing big portions of kelp. Some evidence for this comes from this plot from a kelp forest paper that is really fascinating. So on the x-axis, we have the size of the urchins, and on the y, we have the number of urchins. So we can see that there's a lot of really small urchins, and there's a lot of really big urchins, but in the middle, we don't really have that many. And so what we're seeing here is that each year, there's a big population of urchins that are spawned, and all of those small individuals do a really good job surviving at a small stage because they're just not worth eating. And then as they get to a little bit bigger, they start to die off, mostly from predation. But if they make it through that sort of 50 to 90 range in size, this is in millimeters, they can make it into the sort of safe stage where they're just too big to be eaten by things like lobster and sheephead anymore. And so they have a bimodal distribution of size patterns in the kelp forest. So this is again tying back into this ball diagram state between kelp forests and urchin barrens. So another thing that is really interesting about urchin behavior in particular is that they have this sort of idea of food versus fear. And this ties into what we can kind of think of as a ghost in the kelp forest. So like I said, these otters are gone, the sheephead are small, and the lobster are small. But these urchins are still very, very hesitant to move outside of their shelters during the day. In this particular picture, there's urchins everywhere, so there's a lack of hiding spaces for them. But in a normal setting, all of these would be hidden completely during the day, and they would come out at night to feed on kelp. So even now, despite the fact that there's really very little predation pressure on these animals, they really don't have much in the way of real true fear of predation anymore. They still have this nocturnal feeding cycle where in the daytime they're resting, hiding, and then at night they'll come out and eat. So these shaded bars are nighttime through time on the x-axis. So you can see they're really not moving in the day and then moving at night, moving at night and moving at night, but remaining calm during the day. And so this is even a behavioral link back to previous ecosystem where we have urchins that are in fear of being predated on, and their behavioral patterns still match those old ecosystems. And if we go back even farther than that, and this is going now beyond the urchin story and back into the kelp forest as a broader idea, we can think about the stellar sea cow. So the stellar sea cow is an animal from the family Serenidae. Unfortunately, it was discovered in 1741 and extinct by 1768. So there were very few observations made of these animals at the time, but The Serenidae family includes things like dugongs and manatee now. So these would have been a much bigger version of those. And they would have eaten kelp, mostly in the northern part of the range in Alaska and up along the Aleutian Islands. These animals are really fascinating. They think that they would have been so blubberous and fat that they actually wouldn't have had the ability to swim down into the water. They would have just been sitting on the surface eating kelp the whole time. They also have these really interesting arms that don't have finger bones. The arm is blunt ending at the end of the arm itself, and they reckon that they would have come out of the water onto the beaches and just used them like sticks to dig into the rocks and pull themselves up onto the shore because their finger bones wouldn't have been able to handle that sort of weight and pressure on them. So really cool animals that obviously played a huge role in these ecosystems before we had a chance to understand what that role was. And if we go back even farther than that, back to the Pleistocene, we can see that these environmental changes can have dramatic impacts on kelp forest ecosystems and abundance. So on the top here, the top map is a picture of the modern day Southern California shoreline. At the bottom would have been a picture during the Pleistocene, which is about 12,000 years ago. During the Pleistocene, the water temperature of the Southern California Bight was probably about 8 degrees colder than Celsius. So that would be like more on par with far northern California, very cold water. And the bottom would have been made up mostly of rocky coast rather than sand. And that's because as the sea levels rise, as the glaciers melt, the sea levels rise. And that rising of the sea levels fills in all the bays and estuaries that exist along the shoreline. And that fills in valleys to make bays and estuaries that are now sand filled. And so that the rocky bottom turned into a sandy bottom over the course of the last 5,000 years or so. So we've lost a lot of the kelp habitat in Southern California just through this process alone, let alone the overfishing, otter culling, and Serenidae extinction. So this kind of ties back into a broader idea, which is the idea of a sliding baseline. So we can start thinking, well, what is it that drives these ecosystems, and what is a natural ecosystem? It seems every time we start stepping back through time, what is considered natural changes. And so it's something that each generation must redefine the term natural. And we now have data that goes back a little bit of time, and we can sort of understand what a more pristine ecosystem might look like. But it's really difficult to pull ourselves away from the natural system. So these sort of thought-provoking questions start to come out, like what is conservation of an ecosystem, and what do we strive to conserve it to? What is the state that we want this ecosystem to be in? And at what point are humans just deciding what state is natural for an ecosystem? So I think one thing that really stands out here is that letting nature just be nature is a really important idea. And I think the idea of having reserves set aside is really important, if not for a management perspective, then for a sort of more philosophical reason that we need to understand what the process of the natural world is without us involved in it. And pulling those things apart can be really, really interesting. There's also broad implications here for introductions and removals of species to habitats. So in the top picture here, this is a picture from Palos Verdes Peninsula in LA, where the urchin densities have gone through the roof. And they actually go down there with a hammer and just smash these urchins up. And it has been working. The kelp forests are starting to return, but we can sort of start teasing ourselves and thinking about different ideas of conservation morals and ethics through this lens. And in Hawaii, on the bottom here, this is Trypnoestes gratula. This is the collector urchin, which is currently bred and outplanted into Kaneohe Bay in order to eat down this invasive Capophycus eucheuma complex of algae that's been pretty bad in the bay. And that also has been heralded as quite a success. But it's something that we have to think about before jumping into any sort of management position. And reservations of land, and by that, reservations of marine systems are pretty strict about introducing and removing species for good reason. So kelp, I think, is a really neat organism, a group of organisms, and ties back into some really fundamental questions about nature and about the way that we are tied into it, and the way that we can help preserve it, and the way that we can move forward and learn about the world. So with that, thank you, and I can take questions.